The marketplace stank of ionized kelp and fermented protein paste, the way every trading hub on the Veth corridor did, and Princess Seeravale of the Dominion of Caeldris stood behind a smoked glass panel watching the humans auction themselves off. She had not come here for a guard. She had come to buy grain futures and settle a shipping dispute that had snarled 4 of her family's trade routes for the better part of 6 months. The guard problem was a secondary inconvenience, like a crack in a window you keep meaning to fix. Her previous security detail had been dissolving into political liability ever since the ambush on Tesserith Station, where 3 of her 8 Veth-trained protectors had been killed by something that left no biological trace except a smell like copper and seawater. The other 5 had resigned within a week. They cited exposure compensation clauses. She had stopped being surprised by Veth-trained soldiers when they did things like that. So a guard, something temporary, something she could afford while her family's accounts were frozen by the court dispute. Something that wouldn't draw attention, wouldn't escalate the situation, wouldn't make her look more frightened than she already was to the circles that watched her family and made calculations about weakness. The Human Licensing Board had a booth on the market's lower tier, wedged between a parts salvager and a restaurant that appeared to be serving living things in clear tanks. The board's listings were organized by certification tier, price bracket, and what they called operational specialty. Seeravale had reviewed them on her handheld on the shuttle down. Tier 1 humans, former fleet officers, decorated combatants, specialists with documented kill records against meaningful opposition, ran 12,000 Veth credits a month, minimum. Some ran significantly more. She had a budget of 400. The math was brutal in its simplicity. The woman at the licensing booth had a face like hammered copper, and a manner that suggested she found Seeravale's budget personally offensive. She had rings on 4 fingers and a scar above her right eyebrow, and the look of someone who had seen too many people make the wrong choice to keep pretending she didn't know which choice this was. 400 puts you in the Tier 3 pool, she said. Retirees, washouts, people between better jobs. I understand. Some of them are fine, the woman added, in a tone that implied she was not certain this was true. I can send you 3 profiles, but you understand the Tier 3 pool is. I understand the pool, Seeravale said. Send me 3 profiles. The profiles arrived on her handheld within the hour. She read them in a cafe on the market's upper tier while drinking something blue and sweet that the proprietor had described as refreshing, and that tasted primarily of artificial citrus. 2 profiles were exactly what she'd expected. Men with blurry service records and suspicious gaps in their employment histories, the kind of gaps that could mean anything from personal crisis to undisclosed criminal proceedings. Their certifications were current. Their references were traceable. They would show up on time and stand in the right place, and do everything a guard was supposed to do in any situation that fell within the parameters of their training and experience, which were not extensive. The 3rd profile had no photograph. His certification number was listed valid, current, renewed regularly. His name was listed, Voss Callum, his age, 57, his specialty, listed simply as field operations, which was a category that could encompass anything from maritime security to agricultural pest management. His references were a string of military contractor codes that meant nothing to her, and that she'd have to run through an index to interpret. His current location was listed as a hostile 2 kilometers from the marketplace. His price, 380 Veth credits per month. The cheapest of the 3, by a margin that felt almost embarrassing. She hired him. He arrived at the docking bay where her courier ship, the Maranthes, was berthed, carrying a single bag over one shoulder. The bag looked old. The fastening clasps were a military pattern she didn't recognize, not Veth, not Dominion, not any of the 4 coalition patterns she'd been taught to identify at her family's insistence, when she was young and her mother still believed that learning to read soldier equipment would serve her better than learning to read people. The bag was worn smooth on one side, which meant it had been worn on the same shoulder for years, which meant he'd been carrying it for years, which meant he'd had occasion to keep it ready. He was tall, with the kind of leanness that came from years rather than from any particular discipline. His hair had gone gray at the temples and fully white at the crown, cut close on the sides. He had a scar that ran from the edge of his left eye to a point below his jaw on the same side, and it wasn't the clean line of a blade or the puckered uniformity of a burn. It was older than both of those. It had a texture she couldn't identify from a distance, and chose not to look at too closely when he came within arm's length. She would look at it later, when she'd understood more. He looked at the Maranthas with the expression of a man cataloging information rather than admiring it. His eyes moved across the hull from stern to bow and back again. They rested on the entry point, rested on the shadow thrown by the adjacent berth, rested briefly on the high-mounted service camera that had a blind spot to the left of the main bay door. He noticed the blind spot. She could tell by the way his eyes slowed. He didn't mention it. He just filed it, somewhere behind the unremarkable dark brown of his eyes, and moved on. Lady Sierra Vale, he said. His pronunciation of her name was precise and unaccented in a way that most humans who hadn't studied Caeldris couldn't manage. The tonal markers were exactly right. Callum Voss, I've read your brief. There wasn't much brief to read. No, he glanced at her. You've had a security incident you didn't describe in detail. Previous detail dissolved under exposure clauses. You need coverage for a 12-day transit to Harris Prime and back, with a 2-day layover for business. He paused, eyes moving once more across the Maranthas' hull. Budget suggests this is temporary and that funds are constrained. Which is fine. Most contractors would push for a better rate. I'm not most contractors, he said, without defensiveness or particular pride, just a fact. Can I see the ship's internal layout? She'd expected him to ask about the threat, about what had happened on Tesserith Station, about the enemy if there was one. Every other security professional she'd spoken to in the weeks since Tesserith had led with the threat assessment, because the threat assessment was the interesting part. It was the puzzle, the status signal, the thing that proved they were serious. Callum Voss led with the architecture of the space he'd be protecting. She showed him the ship. He spent 40 minutes on it. He didn't ask many questions and didn't take notes she could see. He checked every junction between compartments, running a hand along the wall seams with his knuckle to test for any anomalies in the paneling. He checked the emergency pressure seals on 3 different hatches, operating each one manually, and then resetting it, testing the response time. He found the maintenance crawlways and traced their routes through the ship with the same unhurried attention, pulling himself partway into each one to verify the dimensions and clearances. He looked at the air recycler intake for what seemed like a long time without touching it. The recycler draws from the cargo hold as a secondary source, he said. Yes, it's a design quirk of the Maranthas class. It's not a quirk, he said. It's a vulnerability. If something gets into the cargo hold, it gets into the air system of every compartment within about 12 minutes. He said this without alarm. He said it the way a plumber might note that a pipe ran too close to the heating coil. Just a fact. Just a thing worth knowing. What are you carrying in the hold? Sealed packaging for the grain contract. Verification samples and bond documents. Nothing biological. Physical seals or biolock? Both. Good. He moved on. He said nothing else about the cargo hold, not then, but she noticed him looking back at the recycler intake from the threshold of the next compartment, the way you look back at a door you've already checked just to be certain it's still there. That night, after she'd retired to her quarters, and the Maranthas had cleared the station's outer marker, and settled into the corridor transit lane, she lay awake and thought about the scar on his face. She'd seen a lot of Tier 3 humans over the years. Her family's household staff included a former military mechanic with a tremor in his hands from something she'd never asked about, a fleet navigator who'd been drummed out of service for insubordination that had later been attributed to a command decision that killed 60 people, and that the navigator had apparently predicted, and a woman who had once been listed as a xenobiological specialist before her licensing had lapsed for reasons no one discussed at staff gatherings. None of them had scars like that. None of them had looked at a ship the way Callum Voss looked at the Maranthas, not like they were protecting it, but like they were understanding it, absorbing it, making it part of a map of contingencies that lived somewhere behind their eyes. She pulled up his certification number on the Galactic Registry. The registry returned a standard civilian contractor license, issued 14 years ago, with a clean renewal history. No commendations, no disciplinary flags, no associated service record from any publicly accessible military or paramilitary database. The field operations specialty was listed with no elaborating credentials, no subsidiary certifications, nothing that would tell a prospective employer what he'd actually done or with whom. She ran the contractor codes from his references through a public index. The index returned nothing useful. The codes existed, they were formatted correctly, had valid checksums, belonged to real contractor organizations, but the specific files they referenced were sealed. Not expunged. Sealed. There was a difference that mattered if you'd ever had to deal with official records professionally. Expunged records looked like holes in a database, a reference where content should be, now containing only an absence marker. Sealed records looked like closed doors. The reference was intact, the content was confirmed to exist, but access required authorization that the standard registry couldn't provide. She closed the registry and looked at the ceiling of her cabin for a while. The drive hum of the Maranthas was a low, steady frequency she traveled with long enough to find almost comforting, and the transit lane outside her port was pale and featureless in the way that deep transit always was. In the morning, he had made coffee. Not Caldrus tea, which was what the ship's galley was stocked for, and what she'd been drinking every morning for the past 7 years, and not a synthetic substitution from the galley's beverage menu. Actual coffee, from a small sealed container he'd apparently packed in his bag alongside whatever else he carried. The smell hit her when she stepped out of her cabin, something rich and dark and complicated, and nothing like the bright sweet smell of the tea she'd expected. There was a mug on the galley counter, already poured. "You don't know how I take it," she said. "Black," he said. He was sitting at the navigation console, reading something on a small handheld whose screen she couldn't see. "In my experience, if the person making coffee drinks it black, the person they're making it for is somewhat more likely to drink it black. Correlation, not certainty. I could be wrong." "You're not," she said. She picked up the mug. He didn't look up from his handheld. "Sleep well." "No." "Me either." He turned a page. "I found the blind spot in the corridor camera system. Between junction 6 and 7, there's about 4 seconds of overlap failure when both cameras cycle simultaneously. They're on the same cycle timing, which was probably a factory default that was never corrected. I've adjusted the cycle timing manually so they stagger instead. You'll notice the coverage pattern in the monitoring feed looks different now. That's correct." She stared at him over the rim of the mug. He still wasn't looking at her. "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's not a problem at all." She sat down across from him. Outside the forward port, the corridor transit lane was a river of pale light, particles excited by the drive field, moving in parallel streams that looked like nothing so much as blood through a vein when viewed from inside the flow. She'd made this transit dozens of times. She'd never found it interesting before. Now she found herself watching it. "What happened on Tesserith Station," she said. It wasn't quite a question. It was the thing she'd been working up to since the previous night, and hadn't quite managed to say directly. He looked up. 3 of your previous detail were killed, he said. His voice was the same it always was, level, not flat, a voice that contained information without performing anything. The report you filed with the VETH licensing board was brief. Biological trace evidence was your word absent. Your remaining detail resigned citing exposure clauses, which indicates the nature of the threat fell outside their contracted parameters. He paused, as though checking what he'd said against something internal. The VETH standard exposure clause covers contact with classified bioweapons, engineered pathogenic agents, and Voakai-class organisms. The coffee was very good. She took a careful sip and focused on that for a moment. Voakai, she said. Not a confirmed identification, he said, but the profile fits. No trace evidence is consistent with Voakai biology. The organism metabolizes its physical evidence as a function of its own life cycle. High lethality against even trained combatants. And the fact that your VETH-trained detail invoked exposure clauses and walked rather than staying in place, which is something VETH-certified security professionals essentially never do. He looked back at his handheld. Someone sent a Voakai after you. If that's true, she said, then hiring a Tier 3 contractor is a fairly inadequate response. It is, he agreed, without any particular distress in his voice. No reassurance, no qualification, no attempt to reframe it, just agreement. Does that concern you? He considered this for a moment with what seemed like genuine thought rather than performance of consideration. I've worked with worse odds, he said finally, and I know more about Voakai-class organisms than most people with Tier 1 certification. He turned another page. How? He looked up at her briefly. Same way I know what your recycler vulnerability means, he said. I've seen what happens when someone doesn't know. She decided not to press it, not yet. Harris Prime came up on their nav plot 17 hours later, and they dropped out of the transit lane into a system crowded with haulers and commercial vessels queued for the orbital processing rings that circled the planet like patient mechanical halos. She had business to conduct 3 meetings on the first day, 2 on the second, and the arbitration conference that was the whole point of the journey. She went to them. Callum Voss walked 6 paces behind her through every one. He said nothing to anyone. He wore the same kind of dark, unremarkable clothing he'd been wearing since she'd met him, carrying the worn bag now in addition to the holster at his hip, and he watched every room the way he'd watched the Maranthas, systematically, without urgency, covering the space rather than any specific person in it. The trade delegates barely noticed him. The arbitration committee chair noticed him, looked at him once with an expression that moved through confusion into discomfort, and then addressed all subsequent remarks to Sierravale as though he didn't exist, which was, she suspected, something he found useful. On the second evening of the layover, she was returning from a reception at the Harris Commerce Hall, the final obligation of the trip, a formal gathering she would have found tedious in the best circumstances and found tonight merely something to be completed, when he stopped walking. He stopped with no warning and no sound, one hand out to the side to halt her forward motion, the other dropping to the worn leather holster at his hip that held a sidearm that looked, honestly, like something from a museum. A Kellerman pattern compact pistol, stamped with manufacturing marks she'd glanced at the first day and not recognized, because the Kellerman pattern had been a preferred military service weapon in a theater she'd never studied. She had noticed it on day 1 and thought, this is the cheapest guard on the board with the cheapest weapon on the board, and 380 credits is probably 379 more than this is worth. She stopped. She said nothing. She had learned in 2 days of watching him work that when Callum Voss did something without offering a simultaneous explanation, the explanation was coming, and it was better to let it arrive on its own than to demand it early and get a compressed version. He was looking at a service corridor that ran along the side of the hall. The entrance to the corridor was behind a maintenance panel that had been replaced recently. The sealant around its edges was a slightly different color than the surrounding wall, the kind of color discrepancy that happened when a patch job used material from a different manufacturing batch. Still faintly tacky under the hall's climate system, which kept the air dry and slightly cool. A skilled maintenance worker might not have caught it, because a skilled maintenance worker wasn't looking for it. It was the kind of detail you'd only catch if you were specifically in the habit of looking for things that had been recently changed in spaces that weren't supposed to have been recently changed. That panel was opened and resealed in the last 48 hours, he said, his voice low and entirely conversational, as though they were discussing the weather. Not by hall maintenance. Their access log is public during events for regulatory reasons, and there's no corridor work scheduled for this wing this week. The corridor runs to the climate node for this section of the hall. He paused. The climate node feeds the air supply for the reception rooms, the service lobby, and the connecting passage to the main atrium. She felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the climate system. "Stay here," he said. "You're going into a maintenance corridor alone, when the threat profile includes an organism that—" "Stay here." He looked at her for exactly 1 second, and his expression was not reassuring in any conventional sense. It wasn't warm, wasn't dismissive, wasn't performatively calm. It was the face of someone running mathematics on a problem they'd already solved a version of before. "I'll be 3 minutes. If I'm not back in 4, contact the corridor authority and move to a crowded public space." He indicated the main entrance of the hall behind her. "In there. Stay in sight of as many people as possible." He was 2 minutes and 40 seconds. When he came back, he was holding a sealed utility pouch he'd taken from the kit on his belt. The kind of kit she'd noticed but not examined on day 1. The kind of kit that could contain medical supplies or sampling equipment or any number of things you'd need in situations she hadn't thought to ask about. He held the pouch with his fingers pinching the seal closed, though the seal was presumably already airtight by design, because that was the kind of thing people did when they were holding something they didn't fully trust containers to be sufficient for. "We need the ship," he said, now without going back through the hall. They went around the exterior of the building. It added 11 minutes to their route through streets that were cold and well-lit and unremarkable, and he spent the entire walk watching the spaces around them. Not the people, the spaces between the structures, the gaps where someone could be without being visible, the angles from which an approach wouldn't be immediately apparent. On the Maranthas, in the small medical bay that was primarily a first aid kit, and a diagnostics panel with one narrow examination table, he laid the sealed pouch flat and stood looking at it. "What's in there?" she said. "A juvenile Volcae," he said. "Underdeveloped. 2-3 weeks out from its introduction point, based on the size and the segmentation pattern of the appendages. Someone placed it in the climate node, where it could distribute itself through the air system over the course of the reception." She stared at the pouch. The shape inside was visible through the translucent biohazard material, small, soft-bodied, tentacled at multiple points, with a translucent quality to its outer layer that let her see something moving inside it. It looked like nothing threatening. It looked like something you might find at the edge of a tide pool on a water world and pick up because it was interesting. Nothing about it looked like something that could end a person. "That's not possible," she said. "A juvenile Volcae can't survive in standard atmospheric conditions. The humidity and oxygen partial pressure requirements are the requirements of the adult organism," he said. "The juvenile biology is substantially different. Juveniles are far more environmentally resilient than adults. That's a feature, not an accident. The juvenile stage is the dispersal stage, and dispersal requires surviving variable conditions. Adults are terminal form organisms. Juveniles are transport form organisms." He looked at the pouch with the expression of someone reviewing a familiar problem. "Most bioweapon protocols are written around the adult form. Intelligence assessments are based on adult form capabilities. Containment procedures are calibrated for adult form behavior. The juvenile form was documented roughly 12 years ago in research that was classified within about 3 weeks of publication, which means that almost no one working in security fields has operational knowledge of it. Almost no one, she said. The juvenile form enters the host through respiratory uptake, he continued, not quite acknowledging what she'd said, or acknowledging it precisely by not acknowledging it. It finds a pathway in the secondary vascular system, goes dormant, and waits for a specific temperature differential, usually triggered by stress response, elevated cortisol, elevated adrenaline, to trigger full development. By the time the host shows symptoms, it's been part of their biology for weeks. He reached into his kit and removed a small glass vial of something that looked like pale yellow suspension, fluid with a slight opalescence to it when it caught the medical bay's overhead light. The 3 on Tesserith Station were probably infected before the attack. The attack provided the stress trigger. The attack was not the cause of death. It was the ignition event for something that had already been living in them for weeks. She sat down on the edge of the examination table. She sat down because her legs had decided they'd been standing for long enough, and the decision had happened without her full participation. The alkaloid compound in that vial, she said, is one of 40 compounds identified as Vokai-specific destabilizers, he said. They evolved in a very specific biochemical niche. Certain alkaloid structures are functionally incompatible with their neural architecture, incompatible in ways that cause rapid cascade failure at the organism level. None of those compounds are in standard medical databases because the research identifying them as relevant to Vokai biology was classified immediately after publication. He set the vial on the edge of the examination table beside the pouch. I carry this one because it's the most stable in transit and has the widest effective spectrum against juvenile stage organisms. I carry several others in different form factors. She was quiet for a moment. The drive hum of the Maranthas at dock was lower than in transit, a different frequency, and the contrast was noticeable now that she was listening for it. Classified research, she said, that you have access to. Had access to, he said, past tense. I've had it long enough that it's simply knowledge now rather than access. He picked up the vial and began treating the pouch contents. I also had access to 12 weeks of field work on a planet called Orcs Minor, where we spent most of our time trying to understand why the colonists were dying without any apparent cause. We lost 9 people before we understood that the water supply had been seeded with juvenile Vokai, introduced at the source months before the colony showed any symptoms, designed to trigger when the stress conditions were right. After the trigger, it was fast. He stopped speaking. The juvenile Vokai in the pouch stopped moving within 90 seconds of the treatment. What happened after, she said, on Orcs Minor? We cleared the colony, he said, treated everyone who hadn't yet triggered, those who had. He set the empty vial down. The mortality rate for triggered adult-stage Vokai infestation is high. We did what we could. My team leader retired afterward. The records were classified. The research we generated was classified. And then the licensing board put me in Tier 3 because I don't have a service record they can point to. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite resignation. It was something more specific. The face of someone who has made peace with an irony rather than resolved it. That's how it works. She looked at the treated pouch, at the vial, at him. Who sent them, she said. Who has access to juvenile Vokai as an assassination tool? That's the right question, he said. He sat down on the single medical stool. This isn't a random threat. Someone who could source a juvenile Vokai, not the adult organism, the juvenile, which requires specific knowledge and specific contacts to acquire, who understood the climate node placement strategy, who had advanced knowledge of the reception seating plan, who had the facility access to modify a maintenance panel 48 hours ahead. That's not an opportunist, and it's not even a very sophisticated criminal organization. That's state-level resources, or someone with deep ties to the kind of people who have them. She was quiet. And they've tried twice, he said. Tesserath was the first. This is the second. First one tests your security response. Does your detail run? Yes. Does that create a gap you try to fill cheaply? Yes. They expected both of those. They planned around both of those. He folded his hands. The second attempt was designed for a specific kind of guard, one who didn't know about juvenile Volkai, one who would walk through that hall without identifying the maintenance panel, or identify the panel and open it and encounter the juvenile organism without the knowledge to contain it safely. She understood. You were supposed to be inadequate. That was the operational assumption, he said. They read your budget constraint and concluded that the resulting hire would be a gap they could exploit. He paused. Their read was wrong. She looked at him. The scar that wasn't a blade or a burn, the old Kellerman in its worn holster, the museum piece bag with its military clasps she still hadn't identified. What were you, she said, before Tier 3, before the sealed records? He looked at the treated pouch on the table. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, someone who spent a long time learning things the rest of the galaxy prefers to pretend don't exist, he said, so that people who encountered those things wouldn't have to learn them the hard way. He picked up the pouch and sealed the medical waste container. It's not a service record, but it's useful. They left Harris Prime the next morning, 2 days ahead of schedule. She had legitimate business reasons to cite for the early departure. The arbitration had resolved faster than expected. The grain contracts were signed. There was nothing procedurally requiring her presence. She also had other reasons that were less procedurally expressible, including a person currently accessing her maintenance panel in the climate node of the Harris Commerce Hall who knew her schedule, and who would know, when the juvenile Volkai failed to trigger on schedule, that something had gone wrong with the plan. She also spent 3 hours of that night running Callum, Voss's contractor codes, through a private intelligence broker her family maintained a subscription with. At rates she currently couldn't afford and would not cancel because there had been 3 occasions in her adult life where the broker had proven worth every credit and several occasions where she'd been grateful to have access even when she didn't immediately use it. The broker's response arrived with a notation that the information was provided at contractual risk and would not appear in any subsequent inquiry records, which was broker language for, "We found something significant, and we don't want to be associated with it." The contractor codes resolved to a unit designation. The unit had no formal name in any accessible database. It was referred to in the broker's file by a number, Detachment 7. Operating period, 22 years across what the broker characterized as theaters of engagement too numerous and too geographically distributed to be consistent with any single service branch. Commendations, sealed. Losses, sealed. Notable operations, sealed, 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 sealed. Decommissioned 11 years ago. Reason for decommission, sealed. One notation was not sealed, which the broker indicated was almost certainly an oversight rather than an authorized disclosure. Unit specialized in biocontainment and xenobiological threat interdiction in both civilian and military contexts. Engaged in 12 confirmed Volkai-class encounters across 6 classified theater areas. 0 personnel losses attributable to Volkai exposure across all 12 engagements. 0. In 12 encounters. With a class of organism that had killed 3 VETH-certified, extensively trained security specialists in a single engagement, and driven 5 more to invoke legal protections and walk away from their principal. She set the broker's file on the edge of her bunk and looked at it in the low light of her cabin, and thought about what it meant to know something for 22 years that the rest of the galaxy preferred to leave unknown. What it looked like from the inside. What it did to the person carrying it when the records got sealed and the unit got decommissioned, and they found themselves in a Tier 3 pool with a scar they hadn't explained, and a bag they'd been carrying for so long the surface had gone smooth. She slept better that night than she had in 6 months. They were 3 hours into the return transit when the second ship appeared. It didn't appear on the long-range navigation sweep. It was already in the transit lane when they entered it, running without transponder, tucked into the particle wake of a large hauler on a heading that put it effectively invisible from standard sensor configurations. The lane current carried everything forward at identical relative velocities, which meant a following ship could maintain exact pace without active drive adjustment, and without triggering the motion differential alerts that standard proximity sensors used. Callum Voss spotted it on a manual scan. He ran from the co-pilot station 40 minutes after they entered the lane, using a sensor protocol she didn't recognize, running it without comment as though it were simply something he did. "Contact," he said. 11 o'clock relative, running without transponder and using the hauler wake for cover. Configuration is a modified courier frame. The hull profile is civilian, but the drive signature is reading higher power than any civilian configuration of that class would need. He was looking at the readout with the same expression he brought to everything. "And it's been holding our exact speed and heading for 36 minutes. She'd pulled up his reading on her display before he finished the sentence. "Smuggler with a modified drive," she said. "The lane is full of them." "Smugglers change heading when they enter the lane," he said. "They deviate toward their actual destination. A ship running straight and holding our pace exactly." He didn't finish the sentence. She could finish it herself. "Options," she said. "Staying in the lane. They can close to interception range inside 20 minutes without raising a flag with lane navigation control. Collision incidents in transit lanes are documented as accidents frequently enough that the initial report doesn't trigger immediate authority response. They'll try to disable the drive, take on boarders, do what they were sent to do." He was watching the contact on the display with steady attention. "Or we drop out early. There's an off-lane system 8 minutes at deviation speed, Kethorval. Uninhabited. 3 cold worlds and some rock. But there's a navigation relay beacon, which means any action taken in that system will be time-stamped and on record. And a corridor authority vessel does a pass of Kethorval approximately every 6 hours on the standard patrol rotation. Witnesses, or the closest available substitute." "Drop us out," she said. He did. His hands on the deviation controls were unhurried and precise, and the Maranthas slid out of the transit lane with a minimum signature exit burn that minimized the disturbance signature visible to lane monitoring. For 3 seconds after the exit, she watched the contact on her display. The lane current would carry it past them if it held course. The geometry was simple: hold course and lose them, or follow and show what it was. The contact's drive signature shifted. It followed. "There we are," he said. There was nothing in his voice that sounded like satisfaction or dread. It was the voice of someone who had just confirmed a hypothesis and was moving to the next step. Kethorval was exactly as described: 3 cold worlds in slow orbital cycles, and a scatter of rock and ice, lit by a distant, pale primary, with the navigation relay beacon at the system's edge blinking its patient orange light into space. He was already opening the emergency communication channel to the relay. Not a distress call, not yet, just a registration ping that put their position on record with a timestamp. If something happened to them in this system, there would be documentation that they had been here. The other ship came out of the transit deviation behind them and immediately adopted an intercept heading. No more pretense. It ran hard toward them, not toward any planet or any other feature of the system, just toward the Maranthas, and the drive signature on its output was considerably more aggressive than anything a courier-class vessel should have been putting out. "Can we run?" she asked. The answer was in the drive output numbers on her display, but she asked anyway. 4 minutes, he said. Their drive is outmatching ours on acceleration, but running isn't what wins this. He had already left the co-pilot seat. He'd done it while she was watching the display, which told her he'd made the decision before she'd asked the question. He was at the manual weapons console. The Maranthas carried 2 short-range defensive turrets, standard commercial-grade piracy deterrent, the kind of installation that insurance underwriters required on courier-class vessels operating in contested corridors, and that most pilots never had occasion to think about after the installation inspection. "What is the play?" she said. "They need to board," he said. "To do what they were sent to do, they need to be on this ship. The Volkai delivery system, that's what the extra power draw is running. A dispersal unit operates at range by contaminating external surfaces, but Volkai require a living host for activation. They can't penetrate a sealed hull in dispersal mode. They need us to open the ship, or they need to match our hull for a hard dock." He was watching the intercept ship's approach vector. "To get us to agree to that, they need to threaten enough damage to the drive that we'd rather take boarders than risk losing the drive entirely in a dead system." She understood the geometry of it. They'll hit the drive. "They'll try to damage the drive enough to make us afraid without actually destroying it," he said. "The drive on a Maranthas is center stern, but the shielding cowling on the secondary intake will deflect first-pass fire from anything that courier is likely to carry. It'll hold 2 hits, maybe 3. He looked at her. "If we take 1 hit, vent from the damaged section but maintain structural integrity, the picture from their perspective is frightened principal, guard who doesn't know what to do, damaged ship. They request dock. We accept. They come aboard." She looked at the approaching ship on her display, at the numbers, at the geometry. "And then," she said. "Then it's a different problem," he said simply, "one I can solve." He said it quietly, without performance, the way you'd say, "and then we'll worry about parking when we get there." She found, in a way she didn't entirely understand at the time, that this was the most reassuring thing she'd heard in 6 months. The other ship fired. The Maranthas shuddered. A deep resonant impact transmitted through the hull, and damage readouts lit across the stern section. The cowling had held, but 2 secondary conduits were venting plasma, and the drive output dropped by 11%. The ship's alert system began its measured chime. Sierravale silenced it with a single input. She opened the comm channel. "Vessel on intercept heading, this is the private courier Maranthas, registry number KL 7734 Maranthas. We are taking damage. We are requesting identification and reason for hostile engagement." She kept her voice steady. It wasn't difficult. She was frightened, which was appropriate and correct, but she was not panicking, which was a choice she was making every second and intended to continue making. "We have filed our position with the Kethorval Navigation Relay and are expecting a corridor authority contact within." The response came in a synthetic voice, modulated to remove any identifying characteristics. "Maranthas, power down your propulsion systems and prepare to receive dock approach. Comply and you will not be harmed. Noncompliance will result in continued drive damage." The synthetic tone made the statement sound identical in emotional texture to every other statement, which was presumably the point. There was no tell in a voice that had been stripped of everything that could be a tell. She looked at Callum Voss. He nodded once. She cut the engines. The intercept ship came in on approach, measured and careful now, running out the docking arm extension on its port side. A hard dock, they were going to mechanically attach to the Maranthas' hull and cut through directly if the airlock didn't open on command. She watched it close on her display. 80 meters, 60, 40. She could see the cutting apparatus in the approach visuals now, mounted at the dock arm's head. Callum Voss had left the weapons console. She registered this peripherally while watching the approach numbers. He'd moved somewhere behind her, and she hadn't tracked where because the approach numbers required her attention. She understood, without turning to look, that wherever he'd gone, It was toward the maintenance crawlway access behind the portside equipment rack. She understood this because she had, over 4 days, started to see the ship the way he'd taught her to see it. Not as a structure she piloted, but as a system of vulnerabilities and uses. The cargo hold recycler intake. The dock clamped with a sound like a struck bell amplified through the entire hull, a resonant final sound. From the exterior airlock, she heard the sounds of a cutting tool beginning its work on the hull beside the lock mechanism. They wanted speed. The cut took roughly 90 seconds on a Maranthas-class hull. It took 80. The boarding party came through the breach in environmental suits, 2 of them, flanking a third figure that was not in a suit and that was not. She understood immediately, and with the specific clarity of someone who has recently been educated in the topic, a standard biological organism in any straightforward sense. The carrier. She could see the movement beneath the surface of its outer layer, the way something vast and distributed moved inside a container that was approximately person-shaped, but was doing a mediocre job of maintaining that approximation. The outer layer was beginning to shift at the extremities. The suited flankers carried weapons, pulse pistols, military grade, not the commercial deterrent equipment she'd been looking at on her own inventory manifest. She was standing in the main cabin, hands visible, alone, playing the role that the situation required. She had been playing roles in business contexts since she was 18 years old, and her mother had started bringing her to trade negotiations, and the role of frightened principal was not outside her repertoire, though she had rarely played it in quite this context. She was also watching the air recycler intake grate on the cabin wall, watching for the specific signature, a very faint iridescence in the fine mist it produced, slightly warmer than the ambient moisture, not quite the color of standard atmospheric water vapor. The pale yellow suspension fluid in aerosol form has a specific optical character when it disperses through a ship's air system. It catches the light differently than water vapor. If you know what to look for, you can see it. She knew what to look for. The carrier thing stopped moving first. It stopped mid-stride, which was telling in a way she could now read. An independent organism experiencing neurological disruption stumbles, sways, makes involuntary corrections. The carrier stopped the way a machine stops when the power to it is cut. The things inside it had been switched off, and the outer layer had nothing left to run it. Both suited flankers processed what had happened in approximately 2 seconds. The first raised its weapon. The second turned toward the air recycler intake and began to understand. The shot from the Kellerman compact came from the maintenance crawlway access panel behind the portside equipment rack, which had been closed when the boarding party came through and was now open approximately 40 centimeters. The Kellerman compact was, it turned out, not in any meaningful sense a museum piece, because a museum piece is something that is preserved because it no longer functions, and the Kellerman in Callum Voss's hand functioned extremely well. The shot hit the weapon of the first flanker with a precision that was not luck and not accident, and that spoke to a relationship between the shooter and the target distance and the specific weapon in question that had been established over a very long time. One flanker without a functional weapon. One flanker processing the implications of what the aerosol in the recycler output was doing to whatever was living inside the environment suit with its biological payload. The second flanker set its weapon on the floor of the cabin. Callum Voss came out of the crawlway access and stood in his main cabin. He had the old Kellerman in his right hand, loose and easy, and his face was exactly the same as it had been that first morning when he'd noted the camera timing overlap without being asked. A man observing facts, finding them within acceptable parameters, moving to the next task. "Sit down," he said to the 2 flankers. "Carefully and slowly, keep your hands visible." They sat down carefully and slowly, and kept their hands visible. She became aware, in the silence that followed, that she had been gripping the navigation console with both hands for some period of time she hadn't tracked. She released it. Her hands were steady when she took them away, which surprised her and also didn't. "You used the compound," she said, "through the cargo hold intake." "I used the primary compound," he said. "Not all of it. Enough for the carrier and the suits. The suits carry biological payload. The flankers aren't transporting their own biology. They're transporting something that was introduced before they boarded." He lowered the Kellerman. "We should have a corridor authority vessel within 40 minutes. The relay logged the dock event in addition to our position registration." He looked at the two suited figures sitting on her cabin floor, long enough to have a productive conversation before they arrive. The conversation was not comfortable for the parties sitting on the floor. By the time the corridor authority vessel came in system 38 minutes later, the patrol vessel Unbroken Meridian, on its standard Kethorval rotation, she had enough from the conversation to name the principles behind the attempt on Tesserith Station, the attempt in the Harris Commerce Hall climate node, and the attempt on her life in this cabin. She had it in her own words, and with enough corroborating physical evidence that the court filing would be straightforward. She filed the preliminary report herself, standing in the threshold of the main cabin with the relay open, speaking clearly and without hesitation. The authority officers on the Unbroken Meridian were efficient and disinclined to ask more questions than the documentation required. The intercept vessel was taken in tow. The two flankers were taken into custody. The carrier entity was flagged for specialist handling, which put a hold on the entire evidence chain until the appropriate specialist could be contacted. The specialist who responded to the flag arrived on the Unbroken Meridian 2 hours later, on the shuttle that also carried the documentation team. She was a compact woman with cropped silver hair and the specific look of someone who had spent a long time in environments where looking tired was a liability and had learned to keep the tiredness somewhere internal. She came through the Maranthas's lock with a containment kit that was exactly the kind of kit that someone who knew what they were dealing with would carry. She stepped into the main cabin and looked at Callum Voss, who was sitting at the navigation console with his hand held out. She said, "Callum." He looked up. "Petra." "A beat. 380 credits a month," she said. "The budget was what it was." "You could have called," she said. "We have active contracts, full certification not sealed." "Actual salary." "The board doesn't list the actual credentials for Detachment 7 alums," he said. "Sealed records make for thin bios, and I needed the work." He looked at the handheld. "How's Orvith Minor?" "Rebuilt," she said. "Mostly. They planted something there, trees, I think, fast-growing ones." She looked at the carrier entity, at the biohazard pouches on the examination table, at the containment setup with a practiced eye that moved the same way his eyes moved, not admiring the problem, cataloging it. "Clean work." "It was close," he said. "It wasn't close," she said. "I've seen your close calls, this wasn't one." He didn't argue. She began working the scene with the documentation team, and Sierravale watched the two of them operate in the same space the way two pieces of machinery operate in a system designed for them. Not constantly interacting, not performing for each other, just moving through the same tasks with the same understanding of where the tasks led. On the return transit, the corridor authority had cleared them to continue once the immediate documentation was complete. With a request for further deposition when she reached the Dominion, Sierravale sat in the pilot's seat and watched the transit lane reassemble itself around them and thought about arithmetic. The arithmetic of 12 engagements and 0 losses. The arithmetic of 380 credits against 12,000. The arithmetic of a sealed record and a Tier 3 listing, and a man who made coffee in someone else's galley without being asked, and adjusted camera timing without being told, and went into a maintenance corridor alone, and came back in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, carrying something terrible in a suitable container. "I'm going to need to revisit our contract," she said. He was in the co-pilot seat. He had the handheld out. He didn't look up. "The 380 was fine," he said. "It was insulting," she said, "and it's not going to continue. I've read the Detachment 7 notation." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the port, the transit lane particles ran in their long parallel streams, pale and patient and indifferent to what moved through them. "What notation?" he said. "The one that wasn't sealed. 0 losses across 12 engagements." She kept her eyes on the nav display. "I hired the cheapest guard on the board because I thought the problem was manageable and the budget was what it was. The problem was not manageable by anyone who wasn't you specifically. The budget was insulting for anyone who wasn't you specifically, and for you specifically it was still insulting, but you took it anyway because—" She paused. "Why did you take it?" He set down the handheld. "Because the job was real," he said, "and I knew how to do it." He was quiet for a moment. "When the records are sealed and the unit is decommissioned and the board puts you in Tier 3 with a bio that reads field operations and nothing else, the options are, don't work or take what there is." He picked up the handheld again. "I'd rather work." She thought about that. "The people behind Tesserath will try again," she said. "The network they were using, the HFY sourcing network, the placement capability, that doesn't dissolve because 2 field operatives were taken into corridor authority custody. The principals are still active. Which means I need someone who has 12 confirmed HFY engagements with 0 losses, and a working relationship with the Corridor Authority Biocontainment Division, and the ability to fix a camera timing problem and make coffee without being asked." She paused. "What does that cost?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might tell her the 380 would continue to be fine. "I don't compromise the people I'm protecting," he said. "That's the terms, not the price. I don't share information with contractors I don't trust without authorization. I work whatever problem is in front of me with whatever I actually have available. I don't perform competence and I don't promise outcomes I can't guarantee." He looked at her sideways. "And the coffee comes out of my own supplies." "I'll cover the coffee," she said. "That's not necessary." "It is," she said. "The coffee is excellent." He looked at the transit lane. Something happened at the edge of his expression, not quite a smile, the same not quite smile she'd seen once before, when she'd told him she knew her own ship. It was small and unperformed and gone in less than a second. "Whatever you can afford," he said. "That's always been the price." She could afford considerably more than 400. The court case would restore her family's accounts, and then some. The evidence she now had against the principals behind Tesserath made the shipping dispute look like a boundary-marking disagreement at a garden party. She would be able to afford Tier 1 contractors for the first time in 6 months. She intended to spend the money on the cheapest guard on the board. Outside, the transit lane ran its patient light in long parallel streams, the particles that physics had excited into brightness moving in their perpetual forward direction, and the Maranthas moved through them unhurried, carrying nothing that could harm its passengers. Watched over by someone who had cost 380 credits, because the record of what he knew was sealed. And the board had nowhere to file 22 years of being the person who went into the worst situations humanity encountered in the dark between stars and came back. He always came back. That, more than the arithmetic, was the thing that mattered. At the edge of Kethorval, the navigation relay beacon continued to blink its patient orange light into the dark, logging nothing further now that the ships were gone. Its work for the day already complete, and already part of the chain of evidence that would bring down a network that had killed 3 people and tried, twice more, to add to that number. 12 engagements. 0 losses. The galaxy didn't know his name. The board listed him as Field Operations, Tier 3, age 57, 380 credits per month, cheapest option available. The sealed files knew what he'd done. The people who had encountered what he'd done knew what it meant. And one alien princess, sitting in the pilot seat of her courier ship in the pale light of a transit lane, now knew exactly what she'd bought without knowing she was buying it. They always got the arithmetic wrong. That was what humanity knew that no one else had figured out, that the most dangerous things in the galaxy are not the ones that announce themselves. They are the ones that show up at 380 credits a month with a worn bag and an old pistol, and know exactly what the recycler intake connects to. She drank the rest of her coffee. It was still good. Back in the Dominion, the court proceedings moved with a speed that surprised everyone except her. The principals behind Tesserith Station, a minor noble house that had been contesting the grain routes for 3 years through legitimate channels before deciding that legitimate channels were moving too slowly, dissolved their legal posture within 2 weeks of the evidence presentation. The shipping routes reopened. The accounts unfroze. The arbitration findings from Harris Prime, combined with the Corridor Authority's documentation of the assault on the Maranthas, produced a settlement large enough that the word's budget constraint ceased to apply to her security arrangements for the foreseeable future. She offered Callum Voss a permanent arrangement the morning after the court proceedings closed. She did it at the galley counter over coffee, because that was where the real conversations happened on the Maranthas, not in formal settings, not over official communications, but in the small space between the galley counter and the navigation console, while something hot was being held and the ship was at dock, and nothing was immediately trying to kill anyone. He said, "Permanent is a long contract." "You worked 22 years in Detachment 7, she said. "You understand long contracts." "That's different," he said. "That was a unit. Same people, same mission framework, individual contracts." "Are what you've been doing for 14 years since," she said, "with sealed credentials and a Tier 3 listing. And you took 380 credits from me and went into a maintenance corridor in a foreign trading hub with no backup, and came out 2 minutes and 40 seconds later with a juvenile Volkai in a biohazard pouch." She looked at him. "Which is not the work of someone who only wants temporary arrangements. That's the work of someone who doesn't know how to do anything else." He was quiet. "I don't know what happened to Detachment 7, she said. "The broker's file wasn't clear on that and I didn't press it. But I know what sealed records look like on people who were doing something that mattered and then weren't allowed to say so anymore. I see it in my household staff. I saw it in every reference code in your portfolio." She picked up her coffee. "The Dominion has resources. The court settlement has improved those resources considerably. If there's a way to get those records unsealed, I'm prepared to make that effort." He looked at her for a moment. She couldn't read what was behind his eyes. She still couldn't, even after 2 weeks, and she suspected she wasn't going to get much better at it. "You do that," he said. "I would." "Why?" She thought about it. The honest answer was complicated, but the core of it was simple. Because she'd watched what he did and how he did it, and the galaxy had precisely enough people who could walk into a maintenance corridor carrying 40 alkaloid compounds and the knowledge of how to use them. And losing one of those people to a Tier 3 listing and sealed records was a specific kind of waste that she found she couldn't leave alone. "Because it's the right thing," she said. "And because the coffee is excellent and I don't want to find out what Tier 3 replacements make." The not-quite smile happened. It lasted longer this time, almost long enough to be called an actual smile, before it settled back into the unremarkable steadiness that was the default of his face. "Permanent," he said. "Terms to be negotiated." "Terms to be negotiated," she agreed, "starting with the records." He picked up his handheld. He turned a page. He appeared to be reading again, though she'd noticed over 2 weeks that he did that when he was thinking about something and wanted his hands to be doing something while he thought. Outside the dockport, the station traffic moved in its patient flows. Cargo vessels and passenger liners and courier ships, and the slow industrial haulers that moved the material of civilization from one place to another, all of it unaware of what had passed through this system in the last 2 weeks. The courts didn't broadcast the details of bioweapon interdiction cases. The Corridor Authority filed its reports in sealed proceedings. The work that Callum Voss did, and the work that Detachment 7 had done for 22 years, remained invisible by design. That was the deal. That had always been the deal. He'd accepted it for 22 years, and for 14 years after, working the gaps between things with his Kellerman and his alkaloid compounds, and his worn bag and his sealed file, going wherever the work was cheap enough to give him without asking what he actually knew. She was going to change that. Not by making him famous. Famous was dangerous, and dangerous was the enemy of useful, but by making sure that the next time a threat like a Volkai seeding turned up somewhere in the Dominion sphere of influence, there was one less sealed door between the problem and the person who knew how to solve it. 380 credits a month. It was a number she was going to think about for a long time. Not with regret exactly, because the hiring decision had worked out in ways she'd had no right to expect, but with a particular kind of attention, the attention you pay to the things that reveal what you didn't know you didn't know. She hadn't known about juvenile Volkai. She hadn't known about secondary recycler vulnerabilities. She hadn't known about Detachment 7 or Orvith Minor or 12 engagements or 0 losses. She hadn't known that a Kellerman compact pistol, which she'd written off as a museum piece, was chambered for a projectile pattern specifically designed to disable weapons rather than injure the person holding them, because the person who designed the Kellerman compact was also the kind of person who understood that taking boarders alive produces more information than not taking them alive. She'd known none of it. She'd bought it anyway, because it was all she could afford, and the thing she'd bought had been worth more than anything she'd ever purchased for 12,000 credits or anything adjacent to it. That was the lesson. She wasn't sure it was a lesson that generalized, because Callum Voss was not a generalization. He was a specific person with a specific history and a specific sealed record, and a specific way of looking at the architecture of spaces that were under threat. But the shape of the lesson was this. The things the galaxy pretends don't exist still exist. The people who know about them still know. And sometimes the cheapest option on the board is the cheapest because the board has no way to price what's actually being offered. She held on to that thought. Outside, the Maranthas rested in its berth, hull clean, cameras properly cycling, cargo hold sealed, recycler intake connecting it to every compartment the way it always had. A vulnerability that was also now a tool. The ship was the same as it had always been. She saw it differently. Callum Voss turned another page. The coffee cooled in their mugs. The work waited.